This content is presented for educational and documentary purposes. It does not promote or glorify violence or criminal behavior. For nearly 20 years, the Green River Killer was a ghost that swallowed girls and women, many of them sex workers, many of them forgotten even before they were found. The investigation stretched across decades, mistakes, suspects, and a silence that seemed unbreakable, until science finally backed the truth into a corner. Gary Ridgway was not the obvious monster. He was the mundane one. And when he fell, the city discovered that the most dangerous kind of threat is the one that learns how to look normal. Part 1. Opening the case file. The file opens in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in the state of Washington, a region that, from a distance, is often sold as a landscape of pine trees, constant rain, and the promise of prosperity. But in the early 1980s, behind the safe image of the Seattle metro area and its surrounding cities, there was a socially fractured territory. Long highways, industrial zones, cheap motels, nighttime meeting spots, and a population invisible to many. Runaway teens, unhoused young people, sex workers trying to survive. Here, what disappears does not always become a headline. It is in this setting that the name Green River appears not as a metaphor, but as geography. In July 1982, the body of a teenage girl was found in the Green River, and before long other women began to surface in nearby areas, especially along travel corridors, roadside stretches, and wooded patches. What initially looked like a series of isolated tragedies soon revealed a pattern, and police began to suspect it wasn't bad luck, nor lifestyle risk, nor coincidence. There was an offender repeating a hunting ritual. The FBI was brought in as early as 1982 to assist with a behavioral profile, a clear sign that the case was already being recognized as large, complex, and dangerous. The 1980s also introduced a crucial factor: the way institutions viewed, or failed to view, certain groups. When victims come from marginalized populations, public urgency tends to be lower, political pressure fades, resources fluctuate, and the social narrative often shifts toward blaming the victim instead of pursuing the offender. In the Green River case, this wasn't a side note. It was part of the fuel that allowed the horror to persist. There were families searching for answers, but there was also a system accustomed to labeling disappearances of vulnerable youth as runaways, relapses, or moved to another city. And every day of delay is an advantage for someone who knows how to hide within the noise of normal life. The investigation became a marathon that spanned generations of detectives, prosecutors, forensic analysts, and journalists. A long hunt doesn't happen only because the criminal was smart. Often, it happens because the environment is primed for erasure. Leads surfaced and then dissolved. Witness statements arrived tangled with fear, shame, and fragmented memories. There was a pattern of vulnerability, and at the same time, a level of brutality that resisted simple explanations. The task force had to work with what it had: fragments of routine, accounts from people surviving on the streets, maps of places no one wanted to look at for too long. The case became an uncomfortable mirror for the city. It showed exactly where the light did not reach. And there is one factor that changes everything when we think about the time of this kind of investigation: technology. In the 1980s, modern forensic techniques were still taking shape, and DNA, now almost synonymous with resolution, was, in practice, a limited, expensive, evolving tool. The Green River case was born in one era and matured in another. That meant evidence collected very early, when there was no way to fully exploit it, could lie dormant for years until science caught up with what investigators suspected. This passage of time proved decisive. The same set of questions that once seemed unsolvable gained new meaning when technology made it possible to link people to scenes and scenes to patterns with greater precision. When Gary Ridgway was arrested in November 2001, it was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of closing a book that had seemed endless. From there, the case moved toward a formal conclusion: charges, plea agreements, confessions, and sentences. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to dozens of murders and received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Later, the number of convictions reached 49. Decades on, authorities were still working to identify remains connected to the case and return names to those who had been reduced to silence. A stark reminder that in this kind of violence, an investigation doesn't end in the courtroom. It ends when each victim is recognized as a person, not a statistic. If this case were only about one man, it would be far too simple. The Green River Killer is also a study in how societies decide who deserves priority protection and how serial killers exploit that exact fracture. The setting isn't just Seattle and its outskirts, it's the combination of social vulnerability, anonymous routes, witnessless nights, and the false sense that some lives can disappear without consequence. And it is against this backdrop, fine rain and long roads, that the Green River File truly opens, not as an elegant mystery, but as an institutional wound that took years to acknowledge its own scale. Part 2. The Mind Behind the Crimes. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and grew up far from the kind of biography that usually sets off obvious alarm bells. What appears first is textbook normalcy: school, work, family, marriage. And it is precisely this facade, the ordinary, repetitive, almost faded life, that makes the case so hard to process. Because in the collective imagination, monsters are supposed to be recognizable. Ridgway wasn't. To neighbors and co-workers, he could be just another quiet man who kept a schedule, held a steady job, and seemed to take up very little space in the world. But the real story begins before adulthood and doesn't need any cinematic drama to be disturbing. Biographical sources describe a childhood marked by family tension, with a mother perceived as domineering, and a home environment where physical discipline and humiliation could surface as everyday language. His father, in turn, is remembered as someone trapped in an unstable marriage, working long hours and bringing home a constant irritation with the world around him. The result was an emotional climate in which affection and security, when they existed at all, seemed conditional. For a child with learning difficulties and limited social skills, this can become a quiet laboratory of resentment. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that accumulates like rust. Ridgway had dyslexia and struggled academically. Biographical records cite below-average cognitive performance and delayed schooling. Psychologically, this doesn't explain anything on its own, but it helps clarify a crucial point. When someone grows up feeling they never meet the expected standard, they may develop an identity rooted in inferiority, and with it, a secret need for compensation. For some, that compensation becomes hard work, obsession with control, rigid religiosity. For others, it becomes a double life. In Ridgway's case, what shocks isn't only what he did, it's how he managed for years to sustain the distance between the ordinary man and the predator. Even at a young age, he showed signs of deeply troubling behavior. There are reports of a violent attack committed during his adolescence, long before the murders that would make him infamous. This kind of episode, when it appears in criminal trajectories, often functions as a window. It suggests that certain internal barriers, empathy, self-control, fear of consequences, may have been weakened early on. Importantly, this does not turn a difficult childhood into destiny. It simply suggests that, in his case, the line between aggressive fantasy and real-world action may have been crossed early. In adulthood, Ridgway pursued the conventional script. He finished high school and joined the U.S. Navy, serving during the Vietnam War on a support ship. Afterward, he returned and built a stable routine: job, marriage, an attempt at a normal life. He married more than once and had a son. On the surface, he was the kind of man who blended into the grocery store aisle without notice. This is a key piece of the puzzle. Serial killers do not always live in outward chaos. Some hide precisely in predictability. For years, his work reinforced that invisibility. News sources describe Ridgway as a truck painter, an industrial worker, without glamour, without spotlight. The detail matters because it creates a cruel contrast. While families searched for missing daughters and investigators chased a phantom, he went home, worked his shifts, paid his bills, and appeared to fit. The word that appears repeatedly in reporting is something like unassuming. And for a serial predator, Being unassuming is part of the method. At certain points, Ridgway also gravitated toward intense religiosity, displaying preacher-like behavior and enforcing strict rules in the home, according to biographical accounts. This kind of posture can be read in two non-exclusive ways. It can be a genuine search for belonging and moral cleansing, but it can also function as a social mask, a perfect shield to deflect suspicion. For some profiles, religion does not emerge as deep internal transformation, but as a tool. It provides the language of purity, offers community, and builds reputation. And reputation, for someone intent on keeping secrets, is currency. The mind behind it all, however, appears to operate in layers. One point frequently cited in the case is the selection of victims in vulnerable situations, especially sex workers and young people with little protective support. This is not just opportunism, it is psychological calculation. Vulnerable people are easier to approach, harder to track, and, tragically, have historically received less institutional urgency when they disappear. For someone with a need for power and control, this scenario offers two rewards: the sensation of total dominance and the perception that the world may be slow to react. From the standpoint of the public persona, Ridgway looked like a simple man: job, family, routine. From the standpoint of the internal persona, sources indicate a man capable of compartmentalization, that is, separating life into sealed boxes without one contaminating the other. This psychological mechanism is very common among criminals who maintain double lives. The same person who chats with a coworker about the weather can, in another context, act in extreme ways, then return to daily life as if they had simply flipped a switch. This isn't magic. It's a kind of coldness learned and practiced, often sustained by internal justifications. They don't count. No one cares. I'm just doing what's already there. When this internal narrative hardens, the moral barrier doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. It's also relevant to note how Ridgway remained for a long time an early suspect, someone who orbited the investigation without being arrested. This reinforces another psychological trait: adaptation. Persistent predators observe their environment, change routes, adjust behaviors, test limits, and when they realize they've survived interviews and suspicion without falling, it can produce a dangerous effect, a sense of invulnerability. This isn't just about evading police, it's about feeding a hidden ego, a private conviction that he is above others and above the system. Ridgway was arrested in November 2001 and, in 2003, pleaded guilty to dozens of murders in a deal that involved cooperation with authorities and resulted in multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. When someone like this finally falls, the lingering question isn't only, how did he do it, but how did he live among everyone else? The answer begins here. Not with an evil genius, but with an outwardly ordinary man, inwardly empty and instrumental, someone who, by all indications, chose victims the world tended to ignore, and used that indifference as part of his disguise. Part 3. Who these victims really were. By the time the press and police began using a nickname for the offender, the Green River Killer, a great deal had already happened. And before any attempt to understand the criminal, there is a basic moral duty: to remember that this case is not about a law enforcement myth, but about real people, with names, histories, and futures cut short. The pattern of victims over the years attributed to Gary Ridgway reveals an old social wound: vulnerability as an exploitable condition. Most were girls and young women. Reporting from the time highlights that nearly all were under 21 years old, with a significant portion being teenagers. Many lived in contexts marked by homelessness, family instability, abuse, substance dependence, or precarious economic survival. And frequently, they were involved in sex work, especially in areas known for street-level prostitution. This is not a statistical footnote. It is the heart of the case. Because each of these conditions, being underage, being a young person without a support network, living on the streets, relying on sex work, increases the risk of disappearing without triggering immediate alarm. And that is precisely where the predator finds an advantage. Not through brilliance, but through a cold understanding that the world tends to take longer to look for certain people, The Green River investigation exposes this inequality. When a victim is treated as less urgent, the criminal gains time, and time, in this kind of violence, turns into repetition. The official number of victims for whom Ridgway was convicted reached 49. He pleaded guilty to 48 murders in 2003 as part of a deal that spared him the death penalty, and the case later saw additional developments involving other deaths linked to him. Beyond that, Ridgway claimed to have killed more. Widely cited sources point to confessions reaching at least 71 victims, and historical suspicions suggest an even higher total, though not all can be confirmed with the same level of legal or forensic certainty. There is also the matter of how these victims were found. This was not a single fixed crime scene, but a pattern of disposal that reinforced dehumanization. Bodies left in isolated areas, woods, embankments, and lightly monitored regions, as if the city itself contained zones of silence where a person could be discarded and still remain unseen. The case's nickname emerges from this geography. The earliest discoveries tied to the investigation occurred in the Green River area, and the name Green River became a label for a sequence of losses. It is essential to understand what these people endured without turning it into spectacle: the manner of death. Sources describe that Ridgway's victims were killed primarily by strangulation or asphyxiation, often manually, and in other cases through ligature strangulation. One early well-documented example is the young woman Wendy Lee Caulfield, found in July 1982, whose cause of death was recorded as strangulation, including the use of her own clothing as a strangulation device. Even within the 49 known victims, the pain has layers. For decades, not all were immediately granted the right to a name. Some remained Jane Doe for long periods, a technical label that aids investigation, but also symbolizes a form of erasure. Someone existed, but the system had not yet been able to return her identity. In recent years, new DNA identification techniques and genetic genealogy have begun to rewrite this chapter, restoring names to families and closing loops that had remained open for decades. In 2023, for example, authorities identified a previously unknown victim as Lori Ann Raspotnik, a 15-year-old who disappeared in 1982. In 2024, officials announced the final identification of remains linked to the last known victim without pending identification, reaffirming that the 49 recognized victims of the case were, at last, more fully accounted for. But accounted for is a poor word compared to what these lives meant. Many were teenagers still discovering who they might become. Others were young women trying to survive in a world that offered few exits. Working, fleeing violent environments, trying to support themselves, trying simply to exist with some autonomy. Some had children. Many had mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends who spent years living in that cruel limbo where hope never fully dies and suspicion never rests. There is also a second layer of victimization that this case exposes: social judgment. Vulnerable victims are often treated as if they somehow signed off on their own risk, as if poverty, addiction, homelessness, or sex work were a kind of permission slip for violence. They are not. Insisting on this truth changes the lens of the documentary. Instead of a spectacle centered on a criminal, the case becomes a portrait of how a society fails to protect those on the margins, and how certain men exploit that failure. In the end, the Green River victims do not form a profile because they were the same. They form a profile because they were placed, by circumstance, trauma, inequality, and lack of support, in a position where a predator believed he could act with fewer consequences. What this section must make clear is simple and brutal. The case did not begin when police formed a task force. It began when the first young woman failed to come home, and when the world, for whatever reason, took too long to realize that she mattered. Part 4. Behavioral Signature. Gary Ridgway's behavioral signature is not just about how he killed. More than anything, it's about how he moved between the city and its shadows, exploiting a collective blind spot. When someone belongs to a marginalized group, their disappearance tends to take longer to become an emergency, and that delay becomes room to operate. The first element of the pattern is victim selection. Ridgway primarily targeted sex workers and vulnerable young people, many of them teenagers and/or unhoused. He chose people for whom the night was work, escape, or survival, people with little protection and a high risk of not being searched for immediately. This is not coincidence. It is strategy. The choice of target was, in itself, a form of control, reducing the likelihood of rapid social reaction, reducing the risk of influential witnesses, and reducing the institutional weight of a disappearance. The second element is the method of approach. What appears repeatedly in case reconstructions is the logic of the everyday predator. He didn't need to force his way into homes or create dramatic scenes. He operated in areas known for street prostitution, especially along routes in southern King County, such as Pacific Highway South, frequently cited in accounts of the case. The approach took place within a context where getting into a stranger's car could be part of the job, a dangerous social contract that he distorted to his advantage. In some descriptions, he used small trust-building cues, such as the appearance of an ordinary man and other markers of normalcy, to lower initial suspicion. The third element is the manner of death, and here clarity matters without being graphic. The victims were killed primarily by strangulation or asphyxiation, often with the hands and, in other cases, through ligature strangulation, including the use of clothing. This detail is not merely technical, it is psychological. Strangulation is often interpreted by experts as a form of violence in which dominance and proximity are central. It is not a distant act. It requires physical control, time, and imposition, functioning as a gesture of absolute power. The fourth element is disposal and crime geography. Ridgway did not rely on a single location. He worked with a mental map of silent zones, areas with little traffic and low surveillance, wooded stretches, hard-to-see spots, margins, and junctions where a car could stop without drawing attention. Sources describe many bodies being left in heavily vegetated or forested areas, including regions associated with the Green River and other locations in southern King County. This dispersion of sites has a practical effect. It makes it harder to connect cases quickly and creates investigative noise. There is a fifth component that, without drifting into sensational detail, helps explain the degree of coldness involved. In some episodes, Ridgway reportedly returned to disposal sites. In criminal dynamics, this can signal two things at once: an attempt to revisit the feeling of control and an impulse to reaffirm it, as if the crime did not end with the act, but needed to be revisited to complete an internal cycle. Returning to the scene can also indicate a dangerous sense of impunity, the belief that the space belongs to him and that no one is watching. Finally, there is adaptation over time, a common trait among persistent serial predators. The Green River case had intense phases, with many crimes concentrated in the early 1980s and then stretched on for years. This suggests an ability to adjust routines, change disposal patterns, and reduce exposure when investigative pressure increased. He didn't need to invent a new method. It was enough to lower risk, exploit the same social vulnerability, and continue appearing invisible in everyday life. In summary, Ridgway's modus operandi rests on four pillars: vulnerable victims, opportunistic approach disguised as normalcy, strangulation as a technique of dominance, and disposal in low visibility zones. It is not a sophisticated script. It is a cruelly efficient one because it rests on an uncomfortable truth. When society is slow to see certain lives, someone with predatory intent finds space to repeat. Part 5. The investigation and the hunt for the mind behind the crimes. When the first body was found in the Green River on July 15, 1982, the initial reaction was shock. But the system had no idea it was facing something that would consume decades. Within less than a month, other bodies appeared in the same region, as if someone were signing the geography, repeating a pattern, and testing the limits of the city's attention. The King County Sheriff's Department itself describes this beginning as the starting point of one of the largest and longest serial murder investigations in United States history. The hunt began where it always begins, with the basics that can quickly turn into a nightmare: identifying victims, retracing last known movements, mapping where they were last seen, understanding who might have had contact with them. But in the Green River case, even this basic work was undermined from the start by a harsh social reality. Many victims were young and vulnerable, and disappearances like these were often reported late, with little information and limited support from a stable family network. The killer, whoever he was, seemed to understand this with cold precision. Still in 1982, once the volume and pattern of cases became clear, the FBI was called in to prepare a psychological profile of the offender. This detail matters because it shows that, from the outset, law enforcement recognized this was not an opportunistic criminal. It was someone repetitive, methodical in the essentials, and likely driven by an internal logic that needed to be decoded. And what do you do when you have a pattern but no face? You turn to what criminology calls victimology and pattern analysis, understanding why those people, why those places, why that type of approach. The investigation expanded, became a task force, and began running on two contradictory forces: urgency and frustration. Urgency because every day without answers could mean new deaths. Frustration because leads seemed to dissolve. The killer left no obvious calling card. He didn't need to break into homes, didn't need to draw attention, didn't need noise. He hid within the normal flow of the night, and that made the city an unintentional accomplice. Cars passing by, people looking the other way, routine swallowing what looked like just another disappearance. Police work then accumulated layers. One layer was on the street, listening to survivors, people working the same areas, taxi drivers, motel clerks, anyone who might have seen a car, a face, a pattern. Another layer was cartographic, connecting where bodies were found, looking for links to highways, wooded areas, places where someone could stop without being seen. And another layer was in the lab, preserving evidence that, at the time, might not have been able to speak fully, but someday could. That someday is a heavy word, because in long investigations there is an invisible enemy called time. Witnesses move away, memories blur, evidence degrades, political priorities shift. And meanwhile, the offender can age, change routines, adjust risk. Green River was not just a case, it was a series of attempts to shorten the predator's advantage. Amid this pressure, suspects emerged, and among them, Gary Ridgway appeared early on the radar. The investigative history records an almost painful detail. Ridgway was investigated and, in 1984, underwent a polygraph test related to the case and was not arrested at that time. This kind of blind spot is devastating for two reasons. First, it can strengthen the criminal. If he feels he has survived contact with police, a sense of impunity can grow. Second, it wears down the investigation. Years later, looking back and realizing the name was already there is like revisiting a door that almost opened and didn't. The hunt then continued in marathon mode. With each new discovery, the task force had to decide: concentrate resources on one suspect or keep the net wide, invest in surveillance, set up decoy operations, follow anonymous tips. All of this under a public cloud that oscillated between fear and indifference. Fear because there was a serial killer, indifference because the victims often came from marginalized groups. What changes an investigation like this is often the moment when science and persistence finally converge. In the Green River case, that convergence crystallized at the end of 2001. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Leon Ridgway was arrested as a suspect in the case, a milestone that officially closed one of the longest periods of uncertainty in the American Northwest. From that point on, the story stopped being only, "Who is it?" and became, "How do we prove it?" and "How many victims still haven't been identified?" According to King County's own public record, after the arrest, Ridgway was initially charged with the murders of a small number of specific victims, and in 2003, additional charges were added, a sign of how the case was formally tied together in stages as evidence and connections were consolidated. In November 2003 came the legal turning point. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders in a deal that spared him the death penalty in exchange for cooperation and details about crimes and victim locations. Press accounts describe the scene as almost clinical, him saying guilty over and over in front of families who had waited decades to hear it. This kind of agreement is always a moral dilemma for prosecutors and investigators. giving up execution in order to deliver as many answers as possible to families, especially when, without cooperation, many cases might never reach definitive closure. And even after the deal, the hunt didn't become the past. It became reconstruction work, locating remains, identifying victims, restoring names. Decades later, this effort is still producing results, such as the identification of previously unknown victims, like Lori Ann Raspotnik, identified in 2023 as a victim previously labeled Bones 17. This kind of outcome shows something essential. The Green River investigation was not only about arresting one man, it was about fighting against time and against social erasure for each victim's right to be recognized. In the end, the Green River Hunt is the story of a system trying to catch up with its own delay. Technological delay, institutional delay, cultural delay, the hesitation to admit that marginalized lives deserve absolute priority. And that is why this case is not just a police chapter. It is a portrait of how a predator can hide within what a society chooses not to see. Part 6. The Endgame. Capture, Trial and Closure. On November 30th, 2001, the hunt crossed a symbolic boundary. The ghost was given a name and handcuffs. Gary Ridgway was arrested and, according to King County's official record, initially charged with the murders of Cynthia Jean Hines, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, and Carol Ann Christensen, 4 names that, in that moment, came to represent the public turning point of an investigation that already felt endless. The impact of that moment lies not only in the arrest itself, but in what it reveals about long-running cases. There is rarely a perfect scene. What exists is persistence, scientific progress, and sometimes a single piece of evidence that finally locks into place. The Associated Press reported that Ridgway was linked by DNA only in 2001, and from there the case moved toward a legal closure that would still take time. In April 2003, additional charges were filed, including Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, and Deborah Estes, showing that the process was being built in layers, as if justice had to gather a story scattered across decades and forests. After the arrest, the focus shifted. It was no longer, who is it? But how do we prove it? And how do we turn decades of pain into verifiable answers? This is where the machinery of the system reveals its full weight. The case demanded a solid conviction, and it also demanded something rare: locating and identifying victims, restoring names, and reducing the number of families trapped in the limbo of maybe. That tension produced the dilemma that often divides public opinion: the maximum sentence or the greatest possible number of answers. On November 5, 2003, the turning point arrived. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder as part of a deal that spared him the death penalty. The Death Penalty Information Center summarizes the core of the agreement. Prosecutors spared Ridgway from execution in exchange for cooperation, primarily to guide investigators to locations connected to victims who had not yet been found. This kind of decision is always bitter, but in the Green River case, the priority was to strip the killer of his final advantage: silence. In court, Ridgway's behavior was described as a jarring contrast to the scale of the case. Reporting on the sentencing depicts him crying and apologizing, reading a handwritten statement. The Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times noted that he apologized for killing all those young women, while families and the judge responded with indignation and accumulated grief. At the same time, what families said during victim impact statements, as reflected in locally published transcripts, recentered the moral axis of the proceeding. This is not about him. It is about the women the system failed to protect in time. There is also the observational aspect of interviews and confessions, an important point for the psychological documentary lens. An article in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin, discussing interviews with psychopathic profiles, cites Ridgway describing the crimes in a calm, casual manner, alternating expressions of regret with a noticeable absence of genuine empathy, a portrait of how some offenders can speak about atrocities as if narrating routine tasks. This is not diagnosis nor spectacle. It is a reminder that in certain profiles, emotion can be a social tool, not evidence of moral conscience. On December 18, 2003, the formal outcome was announced. Ridgway received 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional sentences for evidence tampering related to the cases. The case, however, did not truly end there. In 2011, Reuters reported that Ridgway pleaded guilty to a 49th murder charge following the discovery of remains linked to the case. A reminder that Green River continued to return fragments of the past even after the main conviction. As for his current status, Ridgway is serving his sentence within Washington State's prison system, associated with the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, and recent reports indicate that authorities have continued to transport him under custody for investigative actions related to possible remains and unresolved clarifications. In December 2025, local outlets reported that he was receiving end-of-life care within the prison system, an update that does not alter the sentence, but adds an uncomfortable human detail. The body ages, but the impact of what was done does not age with it. Ridgway was not sentenced to death, so there is no last meal or official last words of execution to record. His judicial end is different. Life imprisonment without parole, partial cooperation as currency, and a case that continues to reverberate because justice, in crimes like this, is not only about punishment, it is about recognition, naming, and restoring dignity to those who were treated as disposable. Part 7. Psychological breakdown of the case. Understanding Gary Ridgway requires one golden rule. Do not confuse explanation with excuse. The goal here is not to humanize the monster in the sense of softening what he did. It is the opposite. It is to look directly at the mind behind the pattern and ask, what internal mechanisms allow someone to kill repeatedly, over decades, and then return home as if they had merely completed a routine? In the Green River case, this question is even more unsettling because the answer does not seem to arise from extraordinary intelligence, hypnotic charisma, or a cinematic life of excess. It arises from something colder and far more likely, the systematic use of the invisible. What is invisible in the individual, and what is invisible in society? Ridgway built his existence the way one builds a hiding place. On the outside, what you see is a man with predictable habits, steady work, and an ordinary appearance. On the inside, based on the case patterns and what is known from similar trajectories, there appears to be a psychological functioning that allows compartmentalization. To compartmentalize is to divide the mind into drawers that do not communicate. In one drawer, he is the employee, the husband, the man who goes unnoticed. In another drawer, he is the predator. The key is not only hiding from others, the key is hiding from oneself, in the sense of not allowing one identity to interfere with the other. For some people, guilt is a weight that spills into everything. For others, guilt is manageable noise. In colder profiles, morality can become a code of convenience. It applies when it protects one's image, not when it protects another person. This often goes hand in hand with a central psychological trait: instrumentalization. People stop being people and become functions. The victim is not someone with a story. She is an object serving a need. When the mind operates this way, empathy becomes optional and often performative. The person learns to imitate socially expected emotions, but internally does not connect to another's suffering. It is not that they intellectually don't understand that the other feels pain. They understand. But that understanding does not cross into the heart. It stays in the brain as data, and data does not stop crime. That coldness, however, rarely comes from nowhere. Childhood and adolescence, without determinism, without simplification, shape the terrain. Ridgway is frequently described as having learning difficulties and experiences of inadequacy. For any adolescent, feeling below others can generate chronic shame. Chronic shame is a quiet kind of pain, not the sadness of grief, but the persistent sense of I am not enough. There are two common routes for dealing with it. One is constructive, effort, humor, development, support. The other is corrosive, resentment, compensatory fantasy, a need to control someone more vulnerable. The resentful mind creates a narrative. The world humiliated me, Now I will humiliate the world. In some cases, that narrative attaches itself especially to figures that symbolize rejection, shame, or loss of control. Here, a delicate dimension enters: his relationship with women, sexuality, and power. Many serial offenders who target women are not motivated solely by sexual desire. Desire may be present, but it is threaded through something else: dominance. The crime becomes a way to transform insecurity into potency. The person who once felt small finds a way to feel enormous, not through merit, but through force. It is a toxic form of power because it depends on another's fragility. And the Green River case screams this reality. The victims were largely young women in vulnerable situations. The target is not random. The target is functional. The choice says, I choose those I can control. At this point, it is useful, carefully, to discuss traits that psychology and criminology often observe in serial offenders without assigning a diagnosis. Some patterns appear compatible with antisocial traits: repeated violation of others' rights, manipulation, instrumental aggression, lack of consistent remorse, repetition. There may also be traits reminiscent of narcissism, not the stereotype of vanity, but narcissism as a fragile structure that needs to feed on superiority. A structurally fragile narcissist cannot tolerate feeling inferior. He must create situations where he is above. And if he cannot achieve real superiority, competence, social recognition, he seeks artificial superiority: control, humiliation, violence. That does not make the criminal special, it makes him dangerous. Ridgway appears to have benefited from a very specific kind of camouflage: banality. Banality is an excellent disguise because no one wants to believe that horror can live inside someone ordinary. And this connects to a social aspect of the case. For a long time, the victims themselves were also treated as banal, as if their lives were a footnote. When a predator encounters a society that trivializes certain people, he finds fertile ground. This does not mean society causes the crime, but it does mean the criminal feeds on the cracks. The predominant method of killing, strangulation, reinforces the interpretation of control. Without graphic detail, it is a form of violence that is psychologically associated with direct imposition of power. It is not distant. It requires proximity and time. For an offender motivated by dominance, this can be part of the gratification, not just harming, but commanding, interrupting, deciding. Psychologically, it is as if he wants to experience an absolute sensation. I decide when you stop. That is the most extreme form of control. For someone who internally feels powerless in other areas of life, that control can become a drug. Why does that drug work? Because in the predator's mental cycle, the crime is not an isolated act. It is a loop. The loop does not begin with the attack. It begins much earlier, in emotional states that seem small in everyday life: frustration, anger, feelings of contempt, sexual resentment, humiliation, loneliness. The person experiences internal discomfort and does not know or does not want to regulate it in a healthy way. He learns that fantasies of control, revenge, dominance bring relief. Fantasy becomes analgesic. And when fantasy becomes habit, it needs larger doses to produce the same relief. The mind then begins to plan. Planning does not require an elaborate scheme. It can be as simple as repeating routes, thinking about places, imagining approaches, creating internal justifications. Planning creates anticipation. Anticipation creates arousal. Execution brings relief. But relief does not last. What follows is emptiness, or the return of frustration, or even irritation with oneself, not for having hurt someone, but for feeling that one needs it. And that emptiness pushes the mind back to fantasy. It is a self-feeding cycle: frustration, fantasy, approach and planning, execution, relief, emptiness and irritation, new frustration, repetition. This cycle explains why many serial killers do not stop once they achieve what they supposedly wanted. Because what they want is not a specific object. It is an internal sensation, control, power, relief, and that sensation is unstable. It demands repetition. In Ridgway's case, the length of the period attributed to him suggests two things that can coexist. First, the existence of phases. Many criminal trajectories have peaks of intensity and moments of relative pause, not necessarily due to remorse, but due to changes in risk, routine, fear of being caught, marriage, work, illness, or police pressure. Second, an ability to adapt. The criminal who lasts for years is often the one who learns from the environment, changes schedules, changes locations, reduces exposure. It is not genius, it is predatory survival. He senses when risk increases and adjusts. He exploits the same vulnerabilities as always, but with less noise. A crucial point here is the difference between declared motivation and hidden motivation. In many cases, when confronted, an offender offers surface explanations. I don't know. I lost control. It was impulse. It was anger. It was desire. These explanations may be partially true, but they are incomplete. Hidden motivation is usually more structural. I needed to feel in control. I wanted to erase someone who reminded me of my shame. I needed to turn vulnerability into power. Hidden motivation can also include directed hatred, not toward a specific individual, but toward a symbolic group. Women, especially women who, in the offender's distorted view, represent temptation, humiliation, rejection, or disorder. The offender creates a moral narrative to legitimize his violence. He tells himself the victim is less, impure, guilty, disposable. This is not genuine religious belief. It is a psychological crutch to anesthetize guilt. Here enters an element that appears in many accounts of Ridgway: religiosity as a mask. Without asserting internal intent as fact, the mechanism can be analyzed. For some people, religion becomes a space of belonging and moral restraint. For others, it becomes an image tool. The person learns the language of good, uses that language to appear trustworthy, and thereby shields himself from suspicion, including his own internal suspicions. If I say I am a person of faith, I see myself as a person of faith, and that creates a layer of self-deception. I cannot be what I do. This is a dangerous mental trick. The subject separates who I am from what I do, and allows the two to coexist without collapse. Another important psychological aspect is what can be called substitute power. When someone cannot feel powerful in legitimate areas, self-esteem, competence, recognition, he seeks power where it is easiest, over those with less power. It is like always choosing the weakest opponent to guarantee victory. Ridgway primarily attacked people living on the social margins. This is not just opportunity, it is a way to guarantee dominance. And dominance for certain personalities functions as emotional fuel. Without it comes insignificance. With it comes a sense of existence. It is grotesque, but it is coherent. Victim choice, then, can carry symbolism. In criminology, this is often discussed as the victim as symbolic substitute. It does not mean the offender is consciously killing the mother or killing an ex. It means the victim profile may represent in his mind something that hurt him: rejection, shame, desire, humiliation. If the offender lived conflicts related to sexuality, control, and morality, he may project these tensions onto women he sees through a distorted lens. A sex worker, for example, may be seen by a predator as a symbol of temptation and simultaneously a symbol of contempt. A perfect contradiction for someone who feels desire and hatred at the same time. The crime then becomes a ritual to resolve the internal contradiction. I desire, I hate, I control, I erase. This logic also helps explain why some offenders return to crime-related locations. The return may be an attempt to revisit the sensation of dominance, as if the mind needs to confirm that it happened and that he succeeded. It is a form of self-affirmation. For narcissistic and antisocial profiles, this self-affirmation can be as important as the original act. It is not only violence, it is an internal theater in which the offender casts himself as the absolute protagonist. But none of this exists in a vacuum. The Green River case is also a study in institutional underestimation. When police, media, and society treat disappearances of sex workers and vulnerable young people as less urgent, the criminal reads the temperature of the world. He senses where reaction is weakest. He identifies where the system is slow, and he turns that into strategy. It must be said plainly, the victims were not chosen because they were less careful. They were chosen because they were less protected. That is not their attribute. It is a failure of the environment. Psychologically, this scenario offers the offender something called intermittent reinforcement. In behavioral psychology, intermittent reinforcement occurs when reward comes sometimes, not always, and this makes behavior more resistant to extinction. A predator who commits crimes and is not caught receives a double reward: internal reward, relief power, and external reward, impunity. Impunity becomes reinforcement, and the more he gets away with it, the more he believes he deserves to. This is a dangerous point. Impunity does not only allow repetition, it builds arrogance. It inflames a belief in superiority. Is it possible to talk about disorders without diagnosing? Yes, using hypothetical didactic language. The behavior described in the case is compatible with traits resembling antisocial personality disorder, persistent disregard for norms and others' rights, manipulation, instrumental aggression, lack of consistent remorse, repetition. It may also resemble psychopathic traits in the clinical sense, not the pop term. Emotional coldness, shallow affect, functional charm when needed, ability to lie without apparent anxiety, and use of others as objects. Diagnosis, however, requires full clinical evaluation, which we do not have. What we have are behavioral patterns and repeated choices that suggest a morally detached mode of functioning. It is also worth noting the relationship between impulsivity and control. At first glance, strangulation and repetition may look like impulse, but serial killers often combine impulsivity in certain moments with control in others. The impulse may lie in deciding to act when opportunity arises. The control lies in target selection and disposal. This creates a hybrid profile, not perfectly organized, not chaotically disorganized. Someone who knows enough to protect himself, but not enough to hide forever. And in this case, he was eventually reached. The question the public most wants answered, and that must be addressed responsibly, is, why did he kill? The most honest answer is that there is no single why, but there is a probable structure. He killed because it worked internally as a reward machine. It generated feelings of power, control, and relief. He killed because he chose vulnerable victims and realized the risk was lower than it should have been. He killed because he transformed frustration and resentment into fantasy, fantasy into habit, and habit into cycle. He killed because over time, repetition crystallized a secret identity, the identity of someone who controls life and death, an identity that compensated for the insignificance of ordinary life. And he continued because impunity reinforced him, and because a mind fed by this kind of dominance does not stay satisfied for long. There is a final aspect, perhaps the most important, the difference between external image and internal image. Externally, Ridgway seemed small, an ordinary man. Internally, crime offered grandeur. This contrast lies at the psychological core of many predators. They live a life that feels mediocre to them and construct a secret that makes them feel special. The secret becomes an invisible throne. And here lies a social danger. When society only looks for the obvious monster, it ignores the banal monster. The banal monster is the one who knows how to blend in, not because he is brilliant, but because people do not want to imagine. So if this part of the documentary needs a didactic conclusion, it is this. Ridgway did not kill by accident, nor only on impulse, nor only for sex. The pattern points to a convergence of forces, resentment and a need for control, fantasy that becomes cycle, victims chosen for vulnerability and social erasure, and an ability to divide his own life into compartments to sustain the mask. Crime, for him, appears to have functioned as a toxic medication against his own sense of insignificance, a medication that requires new doses until the system finally catches up. And that is why understanding is not admiration. Understanding here is prevention, recognizing predators who do not look like predators, recognizing how institutional disregard for marginalized groups creates ground for repetition, recognizing that violence of this kind is not only individual, it is also social, because it rests on the cracks between what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. Part 8. The Final Reckoning. Lessons from the Darkness. The Green River case does not end when the courtroom doors close. It continues as an echo in every family that waited decades for a name, in every photograph kept in a drawer, in every city forced to admit something it would rather deny. There are lives the system is slow to see. And when society is slow to see, someone willing to harm finds space to repeat. Gary Ridgway was convicted and will never again walk freely through the streets of Washington state. But what he exploited remains an open question, because it was not only one man's ability to hide. It was also how easily a normal routine can serve as a curtain, and how easily a marginalized population can be treated as statistical noise rather than a human emergency. The uncomfortable truth is that the Green River Killer did not need to create a new world to do what he did. He simply moved within a world that already existed, a world full of social gaps, chronic loneliness, poverty, unsupported substance dependence, runaways, teenagers who disappear without becoming a priority, women treated as disposable because their lives do not fit the acceptable image society prefers to protect. The criminal does not invent marginalization, he uses it as a tool. And perhaps that is why this case is so hard to watch without looking away. Because it forces the viewer to face a simple point. The predator chose vulnerable victims because he knew they were less defended. The discussion, then, is not only about individual evil, it is about how communities and institutions respond to vulnerability. Who gets searched for immediately? Who becomes a headline? Who merits a task force? Whose face fills the news? And who is reduced to a single line in a report? Over the decades, the case also became a portrait of time. The investigation spanned changes in technology, culture, and priorities, and it taught something essential. Science and persistence matter. Evidence carefully preserved, even when it seemed useless at the time, gained power years later. The Green River story shows that policing and forensics are not only street action, they are also patience, method, documentation, and sometimes the humble recognition that an answer may be waiting for the right tool. But if there is a deeper lesson, human, not technical, it lies in how society talks about victims. When public discourse normalizes phrases like high-risk lifestyle, it risks doing something cruel, turning risk into blame. And that risk, in these cases, almost always grew out of trauma, abandonment, prior violence, poverty, and lack of options. The question should not be, why was she there? The question should be, why are so many people pushed into places where the night becomes survival? And after that, why does the system still fail to protect them with the same urgency? This is where prevention stops being a slogan and becomes a collective responsibility. Prevention is not only more surveillance. Prevention is a safety net. Accessible mental health care, support for runaway youth, public policies that reduce exploitation, harm reduction, combating domestic violence, addiction treatment without shame, protection for sex workers against assault. It is the basics, making a vulnerable life less vulnerable. A predator looks for what is easy. Society can and must work to make harm harder, not only through punishment after the fact, but through protection before it happens. On a psychological level, the case also reminds us that normality can be a disguise. Not every danger announces itself with noise. Sometimes it approaches through silence, routine, and an ordinary appearance. This does not mean living in paranoia, it means living with clarity. It means building cultures where reports are taken seriously, where disappearances are not minimized, where communities do not treat someone else's pain as a problem for other people. And in the end, when the camera pulls back and the file closes, what remains is a kind of silence that is not empty. It is reflective. Because the larger question is not only how did he do it, it is, what does a society reveal about itself when some victims have to die many times, on the street, in abandonment, in moral judgment, before they are taken seriously? And another question, even harder. How many crimes stretch on over time because the world decided certain lives could wait? The Green River case is a dark reminder, but also a call, that every recovered name be more than a number, that every vulnerable young person be seen before they disappear, that justice not be only conviction, but recognition, protection, and memory.